Howdy, folks. Let's take a crack at Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is fairly dense, so I'm going to try to highlight the major models and conclusions of Chapter 5. In a nutshell, Chapter 5 is trying to help acquaint you with market failure. Markets, as we've dealt with them so far, have always produced equilibriums that matched up marginal benefit with marginal cost for the last unit produced, i.e. the last unit that got us to equilibrium. Markets are not always going to be able to do this, and one of the primary reasons that they fail is externalities. This first piece of our Chapter 5 will focus on externalities, and we will talk about spillover costs and spillover benefits as we develop this, and highlight how, in fact, these spillover or unaccounted for costs result in market failure, and there's at least the possibility of being able to avoid market failure if private bargaining can take place. Okay, let's review briefly. We've already established that equilibrium, as expressed by this Q and this P, maximizes producer and consumer surplus. It also, for this last unit, has a marginal benefit of the last unit equal to the costs of producing it. I want you to be able to start thinking about the demand curve as essentially a reflection of private marginal benefits, and the supply curve as a reflection of private marginal costs. I've expressed that for you here. To put it in more plain language though, producers are only willing to produce the next unit of output if the price is sufficiently large to cover the marginal costs of producing that last unit. So obviously, as the price gets higher, more and more producers are willing to provide output, hence the positively sloped supply curve. On the demand side, you can think about this in terms of what the next unit is worth to folks. If in fact you see that prices are rising, then that output had better be valuable in order to get people to continue to want to keep buying it. So as price rises, more and more folks decide that those last units of output do not generate a marginal benefit sufficient to cover the costs of acquiring that output. So really, you can think about for any given Q, you could plug that Q into the supply curve, and you could go and ask what the value or the marginal cost of that unit of output was, or you could ask what the marginal benefit of that unit of output was. In essence, you could start with a Q like this one, and this quantity, if you plug it in, you could see what the marginal cost was of producing that, right? The minimum price that you'd have to allow them to charge in order to cover that cost on the producer side, or what it was worth to the last interested buyer. In other words, what is the price that would have to prevail in order to get folks to demand that last unit. Keep this in mind as we're going forward. It'll be important for you to recognize that demand is a reflection of private marginal benefits and that supply is a reflection of private marginal costs. Okay, so we understand that the supply curve adequately captures private marginal costs, and the demand curve adequately captures private marginal benefits. What they don't do is keep track of spillover costs or spillover benefits. Spillover costs are going to be referred to as negative externalities, and spillover benefits are going to be positive externalities. Here are a few examples that we can talk through briefly. In the positive category, we've got 4 examples of things that are quite useful to society at large, even though they generally don't have to pay for them. So, when your neighbor puts in a nice yard, you get to look at it, but you don't have to pay for it. The more and more people that have car alarms and alarms on their houses, thieves have to worry about getting caught for stealing. That means that there's less likely to be robbery and theft because of these purchases. You benefit from that even if you didn't purchase one of them. Vaccinations. When you get vaccinated, you actually make it less likely for everyone around you to get sick, but they didn't help you pay for your vaccination. It's a spillover benefit for them. When somebody keeps a bunch of bees, they're going to pollinate crops, do nice things for the environment. Once again, you didn't have to help pay for that. Negative externalities. Negative externalities are our spillover costs. And whenever you drive your car around, you pollute. That's a cost that the rest of society bears, right? You're thinking, well, I paid for my gasoline and it's nice to drive around. Yes, it is. But as you drive around, you imposed a cost on the rest of society. Every time folks overuse antibiotics, they help bacteria build up immunity and make it more likely that antibiotics won't work for us in the future the same way they do now. Unhealthy food options, as people continually consume very, very high carbohydrate food, they're more likely to be obese. They're more likely to suffer from type 2 diabetes. All of these things will drive up medical costs within society. It's another negative externality. So there's a few examples there. What I want you to recognize is that if the supply and demand curve do very good jobs at capturing private benefits and costs, it doesn't mean that they necessarily capture societal benefits and costs. In order to start talking about societal benefits and costs, we're going to have to add on, essentially, to both of those curves. When we're thinking about negative externalities, the supply curve captures our marginal costs, private marginal costs. It doesn't capture, however, all of our spillover costs. The difference between the supply curve, right, or your marginal cost curve, and the marginal social cost curve, which I've just drawn in here, is, of course, your negative externality. And it's the negative externality on this unit. Okay. So we're going to have to adjust our supply curve, essentially, in order to capture what's going on here. Similarly, when we talk about positive externalities, we're going to have to adjust our marginal benefit curve, or our demand curve, because it is only capturing private gains. But when you go out and you buy that vaccination, you actually are going to generate benefits beyond just your marginal benefit, right? That's all that the last buyer captured, but they also generated this additional benefit. The difference between MSB and MB is the positive externality on that last unit. Okay, so we understand that we can adjust supply and demand in order to capture spillover costs and spillover benefits. When we put all that information to good use, we now have a reflection of total social costs and total social benefits. And as you might imagine, we're going to aim for this intersection right here. This quantity we'll refer to as Q optimal. And at Q optimal, we are essentially going to follow a version of our golden rule. The last unit that we created generated a social benefit on the margin that was equal to the marginal social cost of creating it. In other words, we've made sure that we're not only paying attention to just private costs and benefits on the margin, but we're also accounting for all of the social spillovers that might be happening. when we can get a market to MSB equals MSC here, then this is of course the efficient level of production. This is where a market needs to be in order to not fail. Okay, so markets need to get to a quantity that has MSB equal to MSC. And if they're not accounting for externalities, they're unlikely to do that. However, there's a gentleman by the name of Coase, and Coase argued that there's no real reason that folks can't overcome externalities as long as they have reasonable expectations, can chat with each other, and have a pretty good sense of the costs and benefits of the activities involved. I've highlighted all these down here at the bottom. The Coase theorem, in a nutshell, basically is that private bargaining allows folks to pay each other off in order to reach efficient outcomes. So we can walk through a couple of quick examples here. In example 1, you've got a situation where your neighbor might be mowing the lawn very early every Saturday morning. You might prefer that they not do that. Even if they have the right to do it, that doesn't mean it's efficient. And if you were to approach your neighbor and offer to pay them off so that they wouldn't do it, then you'd actually have to just figure out between the two of you who valued the silence, so to speak, more. If you were willing to pay $50, your neighbor might be willing to not mow their lawn. In that case, you clearly value the silence more than they value getting the lawn mowed early, and it would be a bargain that both of you would be happy to make. In other words, you're efficiently using the quote-unquote resource. Shared space and noise level is also a similar thing you might imagine, or you might relate to if you've ever had to share a room, a dorm room, or a room with a sibling. This example here, you might imagine that you have a sibling who is continually practicing karaoke for The Voice because they're convinced that they're going to be the next, reality TV star. You might, on the other hand, want to be able to study. And of course, if mom tells you that they have the right to practice karaoke in preparation for fulfilling their dreams, then they have a legal right, but that doesn't mean that you might not be able to get them to stop doing it. It's going to depend on whether or not you value the silence more than they value the karaoke practice time. I'm sure all of you at one point or another have probably bribed a dorm roommate or a sibling to get them to stop doing something. In that case, you're actively bargaining towards a more efficient use of the space. To put this into a slightly more realistic, or maybe not even more realistic, a larger scale, let's say, you can think about a factory that has legal rights, or at least is not breaking the law, when they pour off wastewater into a stream. And if in fact that is not illegal, then you're going to have to live with that unless you value the clean water and stream more than they value the cheap way of getting rid of waste. So even if they're not breaking the law, Coase would suggest that the town and all of the affected parties essentially go in together, memorialize an agreement with the factory that basically sets up a payment system where they will be paid not to pollute. And of course, this is a good outcome for both of you, because if you were willing to pay off the firm to engage in a more expensive method of getting rid of their waste, and you end up with clean water to boot, then this is a good deal for you, particularly if you still value the clean water more than you had to pay for it. In other words, you'd have some consumer surplus. You might think about it that way. So there's 3 quick examples that I hope give you the flavor of the Coase theorem. And I want you to reflect on the fact that in order to get any of these solutions to work, it relied on the ability for people to get the information they needed cheaply, that they were both reasonable in terms of their expectations. They weren't going to lie about how much stuff was actually going to cost or about how much it was worth to them. And they had a good sense of the costs and benefits that were involved. Oftentimes, those things aren't that easy to come by. And if they're not easy to come by, well, markets may end up failing and there may be a clear role for government to step in and try to fix things. We'll pick that up in our next presentation.